In this series of videos, we're going to give you a first worked example in humanities analytics. It's a study of a large set of archives from three newspapers in Europe and the United States. It's The Guardian, the New York Times, and NRC Handelsblad in the Netherlands. And we're going to use these archives to study the ways in which people link together two critical concepts, the concepts associated with capitalism, the way in which we make our money, the price system, and the concepts of democracy, political representation. These questions, the research question we're going to answer, I find personally fascinating, but it's more important, I think, to pay attention to this example as our first introduction to the ways in which, for example, what a research question actually looks like in the process of an investigation. How to take that research question and turn it into a question about patterns. How to then operationalize those patterns for quantitative analysis. And finally, what you'll see is how to visualize and interpret those patterns to enable you to make large, important, definitely true, scholarly claims about this intellectual historical question. So our research question, to be very explicit, is how do people link the concepts of capitalism and democracy? How do people think about one in terms of the other, one through the other? How do people connect them together? At least that's one scale at which we're going to begin. It's where we're going to begin with our research question. As a question, we've left that somewhat domain neutral, but it's obviously something of interest to you if you're in intellectual history. What are these things as ideas, considered as ideas? How do these ideas evolve? How do new configurations, new ways to relate them together arise, right? How do we connect together these two things, capitalism and democracy, as concepts? Is there something in common between the freedom, market freedom, the freedom of markets, and the freedom of elections, right? And I use all of these words, of course, in a highly quotational sense. We're interested not in necessarily what they truly are. We're not doing a philosophical normative analysis, but we're interested in the ways in which the ideas that we believe are their constituents are or are not related. It's also, though, a question not just for an intellectual historian, but for a political scientist. Understanding how people link the concepts of capitalism and democracy matters because it helps us understand how people link political questions to economic ones, which means it helps us understand, for example, potentially how voters behave in an election, what people consider to be politically relevant or not, what's in the domain of action and what's outside. Can we, question capitalism as a system without questioning democracy at the same time? Is there, to quote Margaret Thatcher, is there no alternative? Finally, you can think of this in terms of a cultural history. How is capitalism portrayed? Is it seen, for example, as a friend of democracy? Do these things go together? Open markets, open societies? Or is it a foe? Is capitalism in some way an enemy of democracy in some sense? Are they in tension? More importantly, even larger, is it even a question? Right? Is the relationship between democracy and capitalism something people talk about at this level of abstraction? So this is our research question that we begin with, how people link the concepts. Let's now turn this from a question that could be answered, let's say, in many different ways, into one that refers explicitly to the study of patterns of behavior. And so, in particular, and for many people, this will be so simple or so minor a shift as to be unremarkable. But we'll rephrase the question, how do people link the concepts of capitalism and democracy? We'll rephrase that as a question about the habitual ways in which the two concepts are actually discussed. So we're not going to say, we're not going to do, let's say, a conceptual analysis of the two concepts in the way an analytic philosopher might, nor are we going to try to get directly at the mental representations as a cognitive scientist might. Instead, we're going to look at the habitual practices of discussion out there in the real world, sitting in, happily, three gigantic newspaper archives, right? So this is the archive lust part of humanities analytics. These three newspapers, The Guardian, The New York Times, and NRC Handelsblad, are, there's many things to be said in their favor as sources of understanding this intellectual and political question. Happily, all three of them have lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The Guardian was originally the Manchester Guardian and the Observer. They linked together quite quickly. The New York Times has been running since the 1850s. NRC Handelsblad has been running since the 1830s. Actually, a link or a merger of two previous journals, NRC and Handelsblad. All three of these newspapers are long-lasting. They've had long-term cultural relevance. They've had reasonably stable institutional histories. There will obviously, and we'll mention this, there's obviously something funny happens during World War II for NRC, Handelsblad. But by and large, these are reasonably stable places for us to look for the evolution, the development over time of these large conceptual units, the ways in which we think about capitalism, the ways we think about democracy. So that's our archive. We have our research question, how people link these concepts together. We have our pattern language, which rephrases this as how are these concepts habitually discussed in this case now, newspaper articles over time. We have to cash out, we now have to, let's say, operationalize habitually discussed, and we'll do this in a very simple way. Again, for some people this will be so simple as to be not worthy of remark. But we'll operationalize habitualness, the habits of thought, in terms of word frequencies. Right? The extent to which we use the word X is a signal of the attention we're paying to the underlying concept of X. Roughly speaking, the more often you say a word, the more often you're paying attention to the concepts the word is associated with. Another way to justify this or phrase this is the more often something is said, the more relevant it is to understanding what the discussion is about. Now, as I said, some people this will be completely obvious. For other people, those I think who are more used to a close reading style, those who are more used to, let's say, hermeneutic suspicion, would say this is precisely the wrong way to go about things, right? If you want to understand what's really going on in a newspaper article, what people are really doing, look for the thing they don't say, right? This is maybe the Derridian aspect. Look for the unsaid thing. Maybe it's partially a Freudian account. So, look, I don't think that's the right way to do it. Word frequency is attention. Simply counting words, being sophisticated about it, but simply counting words often gives you a very good insight into what's going on. But it's not an a priori truth. So this is a moment here where we're taking an explicit step going beyond the ways in which, let's say, an intellectual historian works, somebody who deals with concepts and reading, to the way a computer needs to work. Computer can't actually get a PhD in intellectual history. The computer basically can just count things. So what we've done here is operationalize our pattern question. We hope round the back we'll be able to get back into the intellectual question, but we can't do this without this operationalization step. All right, so now that we've accepted, at least for the time being, that we can track the nature of the discussion, the concepts in play, simply by looking at word frequency, let's go in to our archives, and what we're going to do is count words. And in particular, just for this really simple introduction, we're going to count, for example, the number of times the word capitalism appears in articles in the New York Times, our first newspaper under study, over the course of its history. So how do we do this? It turns out to be ridiculously easy once you've done all these conceptual steps ahead of time. You go to the New York Times and you go to their search engine and you type in the word capitalism. Now, the New York Times is a particularly helpful newspaper because it not only allows you to search, but it also allows you to search by date-restricted times. So in this case here, I've searched the New York Times articles for the word capitalism. And I've restricted the search from January 1st, 1937 to December 31st of that same year. When I run that search, when I search for the word capitalism, it tells me I have 304 results. There are 304 articles in the New York Times in that period associated with the word capitalism. Now, one of the things we want to correct for, on the surface, to be clear, on the surface, this is our first measure of the attention being paid to the concept capitalism on its own. We haven't gotten to whether or not capitalism is being connected to democracy, but we'll take this slowly. This is our first measure of attention, But it's natural to say what matters is not the total number of articles, but the overall fraction of articles in the New York Times that are associated, that include that word. So one way to think about this, right, is, I have some newspaper and it's got a certain number of articles in it. If the newspaper gets twice as long, there'll be more articles. There may be more articles about that term. That doesn't necessarily mean that more attention is being paid to that term versus other terms. Really what we're interested in is something more like, if I open like a random page in the newspaper, what's the chance that I encounter an article using that term? So it's sort of what you might think of as a frequentist account of what's going on. So in this case here, we have 304 results for the word capitalism in this date range, but we really want to know how many articles overall were in the New York Times over the course of that year. That will give us a measure of the fraction of articles that include the word. It's perhaps a better way to track the underlying rise and fall of the concept itself. Unfortunately, the New York Times will not tell you directly how many articles it has in any particular date range, but there is a very simple trick that you can use. It's pretty useful. We searched the Times for the word capitalism. We came up with 304 words. We can then just search for the word the in the same date range. We say, okay, Times, give us, tell me how many articles have the word the in them in this date range. Under the presupposition that any article worth its salt is at least going to have that definite article, we now have a rough count of the amount of attention being paid to the word capitalism in this time period. You look at the word the, it occurs in 163,802 articles in the New York Times. So very roughly speaking, that means that 0.1% of the articles in that year are associated with the word capitalism, or at least have the word capitalism in it. How good is this estimate? Well, you could also try and search the word and under the assumption that any article that has, a news article probably has to have the word and. In this case, you actually have slightly fewer articles. You have 153,152 instead of 163,802, right? So there's some difference here. This is a little odd. You might like, what articles have the word the and don't have the word and okay, well, you go look in them and find them. Turns out there's some kind of junky articles, like there's these lists of Coast Guard orders. The Coast Guard orders is like people move from one place to another, right? So the word the appears in these articles, but it turns out not the word and. So in searching for these junk words, these kind of sometimes are called stop words, you'll get some rough estimate. You won't get the full estimate, and of course, there's all sorts of deeper questions here, which is if I'm trying to measure the level of attention being paid to this word, do I really want to include as normalizing articles things like lists of Coast Guard orders? These are pretty rare, but not infinitely rare, as you can see. Maybe 10% of the sample are these kind of odd articles. So what we have here so far is a measure of how many articles include this word and versus the total number of articles. What we're going to do is phrase this as a question about probabilities. We'll say the probability that an article talks about capitalism, so literally it's like I'm reading my newspaper, the probability that if I open my eyes, I'm looking at an article that includes that word. The probability of that happening is simply the number of articles that have the word divided by the number of articles total. Modulo all of these questions about how to count the total number of articles, what I'm going to show you now is a graph of the frequency of articles containing the word capitalism over time in the three newspapers. So in the case of the New York Times, I showed you explicitly how to do this using a search engine the Times provides you. The Guardian has a similar search engine. You have to be a little tricky. In that case, they block you from measuring the word and, so you have to use a different word. NRC Handelsblad is even more frustrating. They don't have an open archive. We had to use LexisNexis. You can measure all of these numbers. We do this year by year. You can measure them all by doing some computer stuff and be quick, or you can literally just hire an undergraduate to do these searches by hand and write down the numbers. So computationally, there's not much sophistication happening here. This is the graph itself, the plot of how these quantities evolve over time. It's a little tricky to read this, so we're going to take you through it step by step. You can see with my pointer here, we have the Guardian, the New York Times, and NRC. The Guardian's in red, the Times in blue, the NRC in ochre, yellow. Let's follow, for the first case, the Guardian here. That's the red line, so this is the Brits. You can see, I'm just going to trace it, follow this red here over time. It goes up in this period here. It's pretty constant. It goes through a couple spikes, and we'll talk about these spikes as we look forward. This graph's a little hard to read because we're putting quite a bit of information on it. What's going on here? So in this case, this moment here, this is where the Guardian seems to have an elevated talk about capitalism, or rather newspaper coverage about capitalism. It's elevated compared to what comes afterwards. And in fact, if you trace this out here, it's the highest fraction of articles associated with the word up until maybe about 2000 and maybe 2008 when we had the most recent global financial crisis. What's going on in this case, The Guardian, if you actually look at the articles, and I always recommend if you're doing quantitative data analysis, I would say look at the articles. One of the things you see happening here is this is an early period of The Guardian when it's actually still the Manchester Guardian. And there's a great deal of discussion about literally the concept of capitalism itself and the relationship industrial workers, and in particular workers up in Manchester, should have to the capitalist system. This partly has to do with the particular history of The Guardian, how it emerged. It was originally owned by a mill owner, a capitalist and industrialist himself. It only changed hands later in the century, and you can see when after it changed hands in this period and going into the 20th century, this coverage changed and actually became quite similar to the coverage given to capitalism by the New York Times in the United States and NRC Handelsblad in the Netherlands. So by the turn of the century, all three of these newspapers, despite the large cultural differences between the three countries, all these newspapers are roughly talking about capitalism less than, it's maybe like a 0.2, 0.3% of the time. What I've overlaid here in these vertical lines are major moments in history that you might think are associated with shifts of attention towards the underlying concepts. I had thought the Belgian general strike, first major strike that happened in Europe, would be a dent. Doesn't make a dent. But it's really hard to ignore the fact that when the Russian Revolution hits in the teens, in the 19-teens, when that starts to happen, when that whole process unfolds, you have a spike in talk about capitalism that occurs simultaneously in all three countries and all three newspapers. The Guardian, the Times, and Handelsblad, all of them suddenly see more than a doubling in the number of articles devoted to this question. As you look forward, the next moment this spike appears is in the 1929 market crash. So this is the crash of the stock market. The spike is somewhat apparent in NRC, mildly apparent in The Guardian. It's, in fact, if you just sort of follow the red line there, not really in effect. You can see it in NRC, kind of goes down. There is a spike there. But the Americans go bananas. The New York Times goes bananas. And you can see that, in fact, the spike associated with talk about capitalism in the New York Times is even higher than the spike that was associated with its coverage in the Russian Revolution. Looking forward, you can see in 1968, sort of the student revolution moment, you'll see a spike there. One thing that's easy to notice is the spike associated with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then I've also put here overlaid the global financial crisis as well. So far, what's happened? We haven't yet gotten to our underlying research question, which is the linkage of capitalism and democracy as concepts. What I've done is given you a visualization of the attention itself being paid to just one of the words, and in particular the word capitalism. What have we seen so far? One thing, if you're a historian, right, is that everything is different. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies going on, and one of the idiosyncrasies is The Guardian early on in this interesting early period where the newspaper is being used in part as a way to educate the working man. For those more interested in general patterns, you also see a lot of remarkable cross-cultural similarity. So you see, for example, that by the 1900s, all three of these newspapers have kind of regularized around a level of abstract discussion of this concept, and it's pretty much on par. It's not, for example, like the Dutch are talking about capitalism 50 times or 100 times more, maybe 50% less, maybe 20% more. The differences are not that large. So you might say the lived experience of being a Guardian reader versus a New York Times reader vis-a-vis this particular problem is not that different. Finally, we can also see, just on the surface, the impact of major historical events. The discussion, the conceptual presentation of these issues is driven in part by major things that happen. Things like the Russian Revolution drive increased discussion. That said, there's a lot of interesting shifts back and forth here. So, for example, if you wanted to make a deal about this, you could study the ways in which the Dutch newspaper, the NRC, starts to talk about capitalism more and more before that global financial crisis hits. Lots of other puzzles, such as what's going on somewhere here just after the 1970s, but we'll put that aside for the moment. We'll do the same thing now, we'll do the same thing for the newspaper coverage of democracy. So just as we counted for each year the number of articles that contain the word divided by the total number of articles, we're going to do the same thing for democracy. Here are the same three newspapers. I'll remind you, blue is the New York Times, red is the Guardian, and orange is NRC Handelsblad. The first thing you'll see, and it's sort of fun, is there is now a major cultural difference, which is that the Americans love talking about democracy. They just can't help it. They talk about democracy at least 5 times as much in some periods, sometimes even 10 times as much as the Europeans and the Brits do. So if you look particularly in the late 19th century, maybe 3-4% of all the articles in the New York Times use the word democracy, whereas less than 1% of the articles in NRC and The Guardian tend to. The other thing you can notice, you look in here, and this is tying to some of the events. Wars are a big deal for democracy talk, especially among the Americans. And in fact, if you look at the World War II period, so the beginning and the end of World War II, and follow that blue line, so that's the fraction of articles discussing the word democracy, you can see that it actually peaks. People talk about democracy at the beginning of a war and at the end of a war, right? Why should we fight in a war? Well, democracy. Okay, the war is over. Did democracy win? Roughly speaking, and I would say jokingly speaking. There are some very interesting patterns that our analysis pulls up. We weren't necessarily expecting to see them, but we're already getting a sense of what happens when you pay attention to how people pay attention. And again, a very simple heuristic is not the conceptual analysis of the word democracy or the conceptual analysis of the word capitalism, but simply tracking the use of that word and how it evolves over time. Lots of pieces of history there that are, remain to be understood. So, for example, I don't know why there's potentially another spike occurring in discussion of democracy around 1890 for the Americans. The other thing we're not going to talk about in this session is the use of statistical error. So, for example, if we look here, we will see, visually, we'll see a spike around 1890 and talk about democracy in the New York Times. We don't, however, know if that is a statistically significant spike compared to where it was a year or 2 years before. This, in some sense, could have been accidental under some kind of null model. I'll remind you of our discussion of null models that happened way early on in the question of Ash. We'll return to it. But whether or not this really is legitimately a doubling or whatever, a 50% increase in frequency attention, whether we're justified in saying that statistically, we're not going to go into that analysis now.